Lazy D here. Today I'm working on this 2016 Kawasaki Mule Pro FX. I'm going to be replacing the steering rack on this thing. I haven't done it before, so I might have to do some editing magic to make it look straightforward. If you find this video helpful, be sure to like, comment, or subscribe. It really helps the channel. Let's go. So this machine I have lifted up on my two-post rack here. This is going to make this job quite a bit easier. I'm sure you could do this on the ground. I'm going to show you. So I'm grabbing the wheel here at 3 and 9 o'clock, and I'm going to wiggle it. And I can see there's looseness coming from the inner tie rod end area underneath this boot. When you're diagnosing your steering rack, you're going to want to make sure that you check all the points. So your outer tie rod end, inner tie rod end, and then the actual rack. So we can see the outer one. It's not too loose on this side. On the driver's side here, not too much play in the outer, but in the inner there's also some play. So before you go buying a whole steering rack, you're going to want to remove this boot. I'm going to show you that. There's a tension clip here, and then there's a more like a band clamp on the inside. I already pulled mine off. I cut it off with a pair of cutting pliers. But I'm going to pull this off real quick and show you how you can determine if you need a whole rack or if you can just do the inner and outer tie rod ends to fix your steering play. So with the steering rack boot removed, now we can see the inner tie rod end, which is replaceable. This is threaded onto, focus here. This is threaded onto this steering rack portion. You can replace just these outer ends if you can, but on mine you can see the actual rack is loose inside the rack housing. So there's no other way to repair this other than to replace the rack. You can even see a little bit of play in the inner tie rod end. Kawasaki, if you buy this from them, sells the rack as a whole unit with the inner and outer tie rod ends and the rack and the new boots and everything. So I'm going to proceed with that. The new rack's about $1,000. If you can just replace your tie rods and the ends, you're going to save quite a bit of money. You can get an aftermarket set of those for about $250 to $300. First thing I'm going to do is take off the wheels. You're obviously going to do this on both sides. Same with some of the steering stuff. I'm only going to show you on one side here. These are a 17 millimeter nut. Next thing, I'm going to disconnect the outer tie rod ends from the knuckle. So there's going to be a cotter pin in this castle nut. And then this nut that attaches the outer tie rod into 22 millimeter. With this nut off, I'm going to go ahead and tap on this. I'm not going to be reusing this. I'm not worried about damaging it with an air hammer. Another effective strategy can be, tapping on the knuckle here with a hammer. Sometimes that'll free it up as well. Before I disconnect the steering shaft from the steering rack, I have a bungee here that I've used to kind of just help secure the steering wheel so it doesn't move too much while I'm working. This isn't so important on side-by-sides, but some vehicles that have a clock spring and electronics in the steering wheel, you don't want to spin them too much one way or the other, so securing them in place is always a good idea. From the driver's side here, if you look up in here, that nut there is what we're going to have to disconnect. I believe it's a 12 millimeter head. I'll edit over this if it's a different size. So I'm going to actually take that all the way out. I'm not sure if I need to, but a lot of times, even though it looks like it's spline, there's actually a cutout in the shaft. So if it comes loose, the bolt still holds it in place. To get to this, I just used a ratchet and an extension and a wobble socket, and I can get right on there and get far enough away to work on it. This cover here is rubber, so you can just pull this back and gain access to that. With that bolt out of the steering shaft connection, I'm going to use this air hammer. I have this, like, I don't know, 18-inch or 24-inch long chisel-ended bit. I'm just going to reach up in here And get on the yoke there. Okay, you can see I got it part of the way off. You can actually see that groove I was talking about that the bolt went through to secure it. It's not going any further, so that tells me that there's no more room for that to go up. So I'm gonna go ahead and unbolt the steering rack and see if I can drop the rest down. But while this is exposed, I'm gonna squirt it with a little bit of PB Blaster, WD-40, whatever penetrating oil you have around is perfect, just to help us when we get ready to pull that out some more. To disconnect the steering rack from the frame, there's 3 bolts. They're through bolts, so you're gonna have to get on both sides. This may take 2 people. They're 17mm hardware on both sides. I can see these on the outside pretty easily, both sides. On the other side, you'll have to take your skid plate off. There's a bunch of Phillips number 3 screws and a plastic skid plate here. This bike, it's missing, but once you get that off, you're gonna be able to see the back of those 3 bolts. Let's see if I can get focused in on that one. We're gonna have to take those off. So they're not welded to the frame, so it's gonna be a little bit of a chore, but I'm gonna work at it here with some extensions and sockets and things. The 2 lower bolts for the steering rack to the frame were pretty easy to get out. As you can see, I have quite the contraption going here. I have a wobble socket to a 3-inch wobble extension to a 12-inch wobble extension to my impact here. This seems to be working. I haven't got the bolt out yet, but it fits and it's spinning, so I just got to back up the other side. It does seem like there's room. You could get a ratchet in there. You might have to get creative with this one. These pieces of hardware have blue Loctite on them, so they're pretty tight. After I got the steering rack bolts out, I was able to wiggle around and use the air hammer a little bit more to get this steering shaft off the steering rack, and now it's loose enough. I haven't tried it totally yet, but I think I'm going to be able to pull it out the driver's side because the steering shaft's on this side. Oh yeah, this just comes right out. The new part I got is a Kawasaki branded steering rack. These are about $1,000. I did see when I was online, there's some aftermarket ones in the $200 range. I don't know how comfortable I'd feel using one of those. It's quite a bit of work to get this in and out, but you know, if you're on a limited budget, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. I got the steering rack placed back in here. I had to move the rack so it was essentially turned all the way. I think it would be to the right, but pulling all the steering components to the driver's side, which would be left if you were sitting in the vehicle, and to get it to slip in there. Now, before I reconnect the steering shaft, I'm going to recenter this rack before I connect it, and I'm going to center it just by measuring the boots on both sides and getting the distance the same on each side so it's centered. Got the steering shaft reconnected. This was a lot easier than getting it off. I just kind of pushed up and wiggled on it once I got everything lined up, and it slipped right on. Before I tighten up that steering shaft, I've started all the bolts in the rack. I would recommend getting each one of them started before tightening any of them down, so you got a little bit of play here. Kawasaki recommends using blue Loctite. I'm going to go ahead and tighten these up now. I'm going to put the torque in here for what these steering rack to frame bolts should be. With the steering rack secured to the frame, I'm going to tighten up the steering shaft coupler onto the shaft that goes into the steering rack. I'll go ahead and put the torque in here for this component as well. Next up is tightening up these outer tie rod ends. These can be a little bit difficult sometimes if the joint actually starts spinning on you. If you press this in while you tighten, it should help you. Also, if that is not enough, sometimes getting a pipe wrench or a wrench on this outer tie rod end and torquing it one way or the other will hold this ball joint that's inside the tie rod end tight enough that you can snug this up. I'll put the torque here. Once you get this outer tie rod end torqued, You might have to go a little tighter than what the torque spec is, but you're gonna wanna line up this castle nut with the hole through it, and then we're gonna put a cotter pin in. So I got a long one, I'll just cut it to fit, but put your cotter pin in, that'll make sure this nut doesn't back off. I'm gonna go ahead and put the wheels back on. I'll put the torque up here for the lug nuts. So I've got my wheels on, and now I need to consider the alignment. It's pretty rare that you're gonna get a steering rack that the alignment's gonna be correct, even a factory one, just by putting it in. If you look, you can kind of see the driver's side is towed in a little bit. The passenger side is towed in even more. So I'm gonna show you where Kawasaki recommends starting, and we'll go from there. Kawasaki gives us a starting point for the alignment. They actually give us a measurement, which is from the outer edge of the steering boot to the back of this nut. Should be 6.14 inches or 156 millimeters. I'm going to put a quick overlay up here you can pause on. You can see those specs and the notes that Kawasaki leaves. This may be close on aftermarket steering racks and steering components. Hard to say, but it might be a good try. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to put my tape measure. So that's about 6 1/8, or yeah, 6 1/8 to maybe 6 3/16 or something. And maybe you can see here, I'm closer to 6 1/2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen up this nut, which is a 22 millimeter, and I'm just going to loosen it back to where it is at that measurement. And then I'm going to use a 15 millimeter on this hex portion of the tie rod to spin this in until I get it where I want it, and I'll recheck. So that's probably about 6 3/16. That's pretty close. So now I'm going to go ahead and run this in. Before you run this in, I should have said this before, you should take this clamp off. This is holding tension on from that boot to the tie rod there. I'll make it a little bit easier. Hopefully you can see that I'm pretty close there. This is going to be a good starting point for me. I'm going to check it with the tape later on the front and back of the tire, but I'm going to do this on both sides, and it should get me really close. In order to align this, Kawasaki has a service procedure. I kind of read through it. I'm going to give you the kind of cliff notes of how we do this. So you need to make a center mark on your tire, and I did this. It's a little bit difficult to use this mark because you're gonna have to measure at the front and the back, but you do want to use the same mark. When I do this, I find if you have a point on your tires, like this is from the molding when the tire was manufactured, I'm gonna use this because it's the same on the front and the back, so I don't have to move the vehicle forward and back as I do this. But what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna measure the line here and the line here on the other side. And when you measure this, you're going to want to measure as close to the axle height as you can. So if you're looking at the tire from the side, it'd be at 9 o'clock and then 3 o'clock. So you're going to measure at the front, and you're going to do this while it's sitting on the ground. I just have it up in the air, so it's a little bit easier for me to show you this. You're going to measure the front and then the back. And for this model, it's going to be towed in, which means the front of the tires are going to be closer together than the rear of the tires by about 10 millimeters. So once you get this set on the ground, measure them both, get your measurement. So what's that, about 3/8 of an inch-ish. So measure and adjust as needed. The steering wheel is not going to be centered. It's likely not going to be centered after you do this. In order to recenter the steering wheel after you've made your adjustment, depending if you want to turn right or left, you'll loosen these nuts on here on the tie rods, and you'll make an adjustment to one side and you'll make the opposite adjustment on the other side to keep everything in your specified measurements, maybe a half turn or a full turn at a time, until the steering wheel is where you want it. Additionally, I'm not going to try this, but some people will take the steering wheel off and just set it in a different spot in the splines. I'm not sure if it's possible on these models. Sometimes they have like a master spline that only fits on one way. But that's the gist of it. Measure the front, measure the back. The front center line, or the front width and the rear width, should be 10 millimeters narrower in the front than the back, so it'll be towed in a little bit. I'll put a picture of the specifications up here. You'll see that it does say that it is in a usable range if it's even, no matter what model you have. And then I'm going to put a picture in here also real quick of the back of my owner's manual, which is how I figured out which specification for me to use. I've made my adjustments. I got some notes I scribbled. Your notes are probably going to be different. It's not really important what my notes are, but as you're taking measurements, I would write them down and then make your adjustment and then measure again and write them down. This is going to help you keep track so you don't get lost in the process of what you're doing. When you get done here, don't forget we got to tighten these tie rod end nuts up. I'm going to put the spec up here for that, and then put these clamps back on the steering boot here. Here with my co-pilot, giving this thing a test drive after the new steering rack. Drives a lot better, and the steering wheel is actually pretty straight when we're going straight, so that's a win for me. Thanks for watching this video. Hopefully it was helpful to you. If it was, please like, comment, or subscribe. Thank you.